Salamander dads are turning into cannibals, threatening species survival. The hellbenders' alarming change in behavior may be linked to deforestation, a new study found. The hellbender salamander has been called a lot of things: snot otter, mud devil, old lasagna sides, and now, perhaps, baby-eating cannibal, according to new research into the parental habits of these giant amphibians. An 8-year study of hellbenders living in the cold, rocky rivers of southwestern Virginia has found that male salamanders are increasingly consuming their own young in areas near decimated forests. Without abutting trees, pollutants flow into the rivers, leading to changes in water chemistry that seem to be altering paternal behavior, the researchers said. Infanticide is becoming so widespread that eastern hellbenders, the largest salamander in North America, measuring 2 feet long and weighing up to 5 pounds, may be on the cusp of eating their future generations into extinction. If you have rates of cannibalism this high, then that alone is enough to explain many of the population declines we've seen across the species range, said Bill Hopkins, an ecologist at Virginia Tech who led the research. The findings will appear in a forthcoming issue of the American Naturalist. Eastern hellbenders once thrived across 15 states, from Mississippi and Missouri in the south and Midwest to New York and Pennsylvania in the northeast. Their numbers have dwindled over the past 50 years, however, and researchers have struggled to explain why. Habitat loss, disease, poaching and climate change all probably contribute to some extent, but according to Dr. Hopkins's research, the driving factor might be baby eating in response to deforestation. The practice of eating one's own offspring, known as filial cannibalism, is common among species that, like the eastern hellbender, have evolved a parenting system in which fathers provide the bulk of early care. Continue reading the main story. In the fall breeding season, female hellbenders lay their clutch of eggs and take off. Males fertilize the eggs externally and then stick around for months, helping to fend off predators and to keep the eggs healthy until they hatch. But in the face of hardship, these dedicated dads morph into amphibious Hannibal Lecters, eating up broods with low chances of survival. This act of reproductive sacrifice helps the salamanders conserve energy in lean times and boosts their chances of surviving long enough to make more and stronger babies in the future. Biologists who study hellbender behavior had previously noted this form of infanticide on occasion. However, Dr. Hopkins's research suggests that filial cannibalism may be on the rise, with environmental damage spurred by human activities such as cutting down forests for cattle pastures, likely to blame. Dr. Hopkins and his colleagues set up hundreds of underwater nest boxes in 3 rivers dotted across the upper Tennessee River basin of southwestern Virginia. From 2013 to 2020, they monitored each box, tracking the fate of any egg clusters they found. They saw that in areas with lush forest cover, dads ate their entire spawn around 14% of the time. But this happened more than 3 times as often wherever nearby trees had been cut down. The hellbenders seem to have fallen into what Hope Klug, an evolutionary biologist from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, described as an evolutionary trap. They're exhibiting this behavior that was once adaptive, she said, but it's no longer adaptive due to this really rapid environmental change. Shem Unger, a conservation geneticist at Wingate University in North Carolina, said that the findings were alarming. We need to ensure streams are protected, so that these giants of the rivers remain for future generations, he said. Dr. Hopkins's team also collected blood samples from the hellbenders and looked for changes in stress and reproductive hormones at sites of forest degradation that might account for the uptick in cannibalism. They came up empty-handed. Body condition, clutch size or food availability didn't seem to be implicated either. Dr. Hopkins suspects that changes in water chemistry could be spurring the behavioral shift, and he now has sensors in place tracking river conditions to test that hypothesis. Efforts are ongoing to create forested buffers along streams that reduce erosion, filter pollutants, and improve overall water conditions for hellbenders. But in the meantime, Dr. Hopkins is planning to collect vulnerable eggs, raise them in his laboratory and reintroduce them as larvae, past the age when they typically fall prey to their dad's attack. It's a stopgap, said J.D. Cleopfer, a herpetologist with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, who is helping to coordinate the effort. We are kind of holding the line while the habitat restoration work catches up. You wouldn't think hellbenders would be hard to find. The huge salamanders, the biggest amphibians in North America, can grow up to 30 inches long. Yet hellbenders make themselves scarce, living on the bottoms of mountain streams, lurking under massive rocks. As a result, locating hellbenders takes a crew of scientists. First, some of them must wedge a long pole under a rock to hoist it up, and then their colleagues must plunge into the chilly water to catch their quarry. A couple of years ago, Stephen Spear, a conservation scientist at the Orient Society in Athens, GA, heard about a possible alternative. Instead of finding rare animals, some experts were gathering animal DNA from their habitats. That way, they didn't have to track down a species to be sure it was there. Dr. Spear decided to try. He traveled to rivers in the southeast where he and his colleagues had found hellbenders and scooped water into jugs. One day on the banks of the Clint River in Tennessee, Dr. Spear met fishermen curious about what he was up to. Looking across the broad river rushing by, he explained that he was trying to catch a few bits of genetic material from a single hellbender lurking under a distant rock. You just felt silly, Dr. Spear said. I won't lie. I wasn't convinced it would work. Despite his doubts, Dr. Spear and his colleagues analyzed the water for traces of hellbender DNA. As they reported in the journal Biological Conservation, it was there. Essentially, everywhere that we know that they're there from past surveys, we'd pick them up, Dr. Spear said. Outside the hellbender's range, the scientists failed to find any of its DNA, making contamination an unlikely explanation for their results. I converted pretty quickly, Dr. Spear said. He is not the only convert. Over the past few years, scientists have found DNA that many animals shed in their surroundings. These genetic signatures provide valuable clues, helping researchers track invasive species moving into new territories and endangered animals flirting with extinction. Eventually, it may be possible to estimate the population of a species in a habitat simply by measuring how much DNA they leave. And instead of toting up hellbenders or other elusive critters, scientists may be able to catalog much of the diversity in animals and plants in a particular ecosystem simply by collecting DNA. Continue reading the main story. The first scientists to gather environmental DNA were microbiologists taking advantage of the universal abundance of microbes. A single spoonful of soil harbors a billion bacteria, for example, each packed with DNA. Then zoologists started isolating animal DNA from hair and fresh feces. Still, they considered it very rare for animal DNA to survive for long in the environment on its own. In recent years, that assumption has been proved wrong. Willerslev, a pioneer in environmental DNA at the University of Copenhagen, and his colleagues ran a series of experiments that showed environmental DNA can give zoologists a reliable snapshot of the animals in a particular place. In zoos, for example, they dug deep into the dirt and found DNA matching that of the elephants, lions and other animals living in each enclosure. Dr. Willerslev and his colleagues also investigated lakes and other bodies of water, discovering that animal DNA could survive at detectable levels for weeks. Their methods were so sensitive that they found DNA from deer that had drunk at the edges of ponds. For zoologists, these results were a breakthrough. In the past 3 years or so, the field has completely exploded, Dr. Willerslev said. The standard methods for counting animals can be expensive, time-consuming and limited. To survey salmon, for example, scientists typically build traps known as weirs to catch fish as they swim upriver to spawn. But in the raging waters of spring, most salmon may slip by, swimming into streams stretching across vast watersheds. Matthew B. Laramie, an ecologist with the United States Geological Survey, studies the Chinook salmon that live in northern Washington state. After learning of some early successes with environmental DNA, he decided to look for Chinook DNA across hundreds of square miles of streams and rivers. Like Dr. Spear, he started out a skeptic. I had my doubts, he said. These rivers are swollen with a lot of water, a lot of debris. But as Mr. Laramie and his colleagues reported in Biological Conservation, they found Chinook DNA in most of the places where they knew the fish were, and didn't find it in most places where these salmon had not been found. Mr. Laramie expects that environmental DNA will become useful for tracking the spread of salmon now returning to parts of their historical range. Scientists should be able to follow them as they recolonize streams and rivers, and other researchers will be able to borrow the methods that he and others are developing to study other fish. They can kind of take it and run, Mr. Laramie said.